Treasurer, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
This is unquestionably a big moment. The Governor said today the decision to cut the cash rate was not a lay-down misère. How much were you sweating the decision?
Well, I see it as welcome relief for millions of Australians. I see it as the rate relief that people needed and deserved after all of the progress that Australians have made together in the fight against inflation. Obviously, like a lot of Australians, I was interested to hear the outcome this afternoon. I think it's a good outcome for millions of people, but we know that the cost of living pressures are still there. You know, it won't solve every challenge that we've got in our economy or in household budgets, but it will help, and that's a good thing.
You'd accept, however, that this is an intensely political moment at the same time. Does this cut set you up for a swift campaign focused on your management of inflation, the root cause of the cost of living crisis?
Well, first of all, I do acknowledge that there's a lot of political commentary around the decision, but what I've tried to do is not add to that. I think the facts of the matter are that under this Labor government, we've been able to get inflation down, wages up, keep unemployment low, and now we've got interest rates coming down as well. Those are the facts of the matter. They will be part of the story that we tell Australians when we ask them to make an important choice later this year between a government which has been focused on the cost of living, is getting inflation down, is building Australia's future, versus an alternative under Peter Dutton, which would make people worse off and take Australia backwards. We have made a lot of progress together as Australians over the course of the last couple of years, but it has been difficult as well. And that's why the government has maintained this focus on cost of living and inflation. It's why we've made so much progress, and it's why we've seen this outcome today from the Reserve Bank.
Have you spoken to the Prime Minister since the announcement?
No, we've had an exchange, but I haven't spoken to him yet. Obviously, I'll have the opportunity to do that before long. The first calls I made after this decision was made public was actually the CEOs of the 4 major banks. Wanted to make sure that there would be a speedy pass-through of the full benefit of this interest rate cut. I don't take any credit for the fact that the 4 banks have all indicated that they will pass it on in full. They were already considering things along those lines, but those were the calls after the decision. Those are the calls that I made after the decision was made public.
Now, the Governor warned against relying on any predictions for a series of cuts. She described the market expectations that have suggested that as unrealistic, pretty clear term from her. If this is the only cut in the near or foreseeable future, does that make a strong argument for an election before the next RBA meeting in April?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very good thing that Governor Bullock makes herself available after these decisions to talk the Australian people through the decisions that has been taken. Central bank governors are a cautious lot.
Now, you're starting you're just starting the answer to the question an awfully long way from where the question was, so maybe we could come back to that. Does this strengthen the case for an election before the next RBA meeting, because it's unlikely we'll get a series of cuts?
Well, you asked me about the Reserve Bank's Governor's commentary. I was responding to that. When it comes to the election timing, that's a matter for the Prime Minister. We're working towards a budget on the 25th of March. As I said before, I try not to apply a political lens to the decision that's been taken today. My job in the government is to obsess over the numbers in the economy, not to obsess over numbers in the opinion polls or election dates and the like. Our focus was on the cost of living before this decision. It will be on the cost of living after this decision, no matter when the election is.
Does this single measure on inflation, do you think, do enough in the voters' minds to offset the collapse in their living standards?
Well, I think that remains to be seen, to be frank about it. I think we have acknowledged throughout that it's been an especially difficult period for Australians. We saw inflation much higher and rising when we came to office. Living standards and real wages were falling when we came to office. And we've been working very hard to try and turn that around. It's been a good thing that real wages are growing again. Living standards, disposable incomes are growing again. The tax cuts are part of the story. Getting wages moving again. All of those things are important. But we recognise that the pressures on household budgets are very substantial, even with all of this progress that we've made together as a country and even with this decision taken today by the Reserve Bank. And that's why our focus will continue to be on rolling out our cost of living help and managing the budget in the most responsible way that we can. We're not getting carried away by this decision today. It will help. It won't solve every challenge in our economy or in household budgets. And that's why the hard work of managing our economy and our budget responsibly continues.
Can we reasonably assume that you won't now be delivering a budget before the election?
I wouldn't make that assumption. I mean, we're still working towards that budget towards the end of March. We're in the Cabinet suite right now speaking to you, Sarah. I've spent the bulk of the last day and a half in the Cabinet suite putting together the budget with my Expenditure Review Committee colleagues, including the Finance Minister, Katie Gallagher. So we're working towards that. We acknowledge that the time of the election is up to the Prime Minister in consultation with his senior colleagues, but our expectation and our work that we're doing right now is to prepare a budget for the end of March.
The Governor today talked about the need for productivity in Australia to lift. McKinsey's described Australia's productivity recently as being so bad it's a national emergency and it's not a unique view. How much responsibility does the Albanese government bear for its failure to power productivity growth?
Well, first of all, we take responsibility for doing what we can to turn around what has been decades of poor productivity. You know, the weakest decade for productivity was the decade to 2020 in the last 60 years when it comes to productivity growth. You can't just turn 2 decades of weak productivity growth around in 2 years. But we have been working with when it comes to skills and education, when it comes to the energy transformation, how we adapt and adopt technology, competition policy, all of these ways that we try and turn this around, but it will take some time. And I think that commentary that the Reserve Bank made today about productivity is a view that we share, not the only view that they put today that we share. We also share the view that there is a lot of uncertainty in the global economy right now. I think the Reserve Bank Governor said that she's optimistic about the economy but alive to the risks, including when it comes to things like productivity. So we share that view. Productivity is an ongoing challenge in our economy. We're working to turn it around, but we won't be able to turn it around immediately because it's been an entrenched problem that has existed for some decades.
You've been in politics for most of your adult life, and so have many of your fellow Labor ministers. You all had high hopes when you won government. How will you justify it to yourselves if you lose after one term?
Well, I'm obviously not going to get into that sort of hypothetical, and it's not about us. You know, it's about the outcomes that we can deliver for the Australian people. And I go back to what Australians have achieved while we've been in office. You know, it's unusual around the world to see inflation down, wages up, unemployment very low, and interest rates being cut. But that's the combination that we've seen here in Australia. Now, we don't take all the credit for that. The credit for that belongs to the Australian people who've been through and are going through very difficult times. But we have made a lot of progress together. We have tried to take the right economic decisions for the right economic reasons. And I believe if you do that, the politics will take care of themselves.
If only that were the case. Treasurer, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Former Assistant Governor at the Reserve Bank, Luci Ellis, is now Westpac's chief economist. She joins us for her interpretation of today's decision. Luci Ellis, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
There was so much expectation around the cut today. I think some people would have been surprised by the description that it was actually a very close decision in the end. Why was it such a close call?
Well, it was a consensus on the board to cut rates, and we think they would have really struggled to explain keeping rates on hold. But the reality is that the RBA is still very worried that there's too much inflationary pressure in the economy. They've been surprised with how tight the labour market's been, and so they are concerned that inflation won't get all the way down to 2.5%. At the moment, it's running at an annual rate of 2.7, and that's where they think it's going to stay.
Now, she said expectations of a series of rises this year were unrealistic. Do you think she's right about that?
I can understand that they're uncertain and that they wouldn't want to bet money on how many times they're going to cut based on what they're thinking about the economy, based on their concerns about the tight labour market. But I think a lot of other people are seeing that they have had to revise down their inflation forecasts and their wages forecasts, and maybe they're just still being a little bit too pessimistic about what is possible in terms of keeping unemployment low while still getting inflation all the way down to the midpoint of their 2 to 3% target range. So they're not willing to bet on that, but we think it's still, entirely plausible.
So you think it is possible there could be a number of rate cuts this year?
That's still our expectation. It was our expectation going into today's meeting. But we have a view about the economy that is a bit different. Your views about the economy will always differ. Forecasts are never perfect, and people can come to different views. Our expectation is that unemployment will increase a little bit more than what they're expecting. We expect that wages growth won't stay as high as what they're thinking, and we think that there is actually probably a little bit more of a decline in inflation to come. And in any case, that 0.2 of a percentage point in their forecasts isn't really all that much to be wringing their hands about. I think it's really a statement about the degree of uncertainty that they have, given the international environment and given the surprising resilience in the labour market in Australia.
Let's just talk about that for a moment. I mean, there's lots of academic debate about the right level of unemployment to make the economy function as it should. Put that academic debate aside, put simply, do more people have to lose their jobs for inflation to come down to the place we want it to be?
I think the way the RBA would want it to play out is that it's not about people losing their jobs, but just perhaps as the labour force grows, not everybody gets a job at the same rate. So employment itself keeps growing, but not fast enough to keep pace with the increase in the number of people who want a job. So it's not necessarily about putting people out of jobs, but they are still clearly of the view that where unemployment is, where the rate of job vacancies is, where the rate of underemployment is all saying that the labour market is still tight. And when you survey employers, they say it is hard to find suitable labour. Where I think they are perhaps a little bit too pessimistic about what's possible, and also expecting the labour market to stay tighter for longer, is that so much of the employment growth over the last 12 to 18 months has come from the care economy. It's come from healthcare, social care, childcare, disability care. That's accounted for a very large fraction of the employment growth over the last 12 to 18 months. And that won't go on forever. And at some point, that ramp up peters out, and there's a real question mark about whether employment in other sectors will expand to fill that gap. And if that happens, then actually the labour market could slow much more than the RBA is expecting.
If the government pledges further cost of living relief before or during the campaign, will that run counter to the Reserve Bank's priorities?
I think there's been a lot of nervousness that the more governments spend, the more demand that puts into the economy, and so it keeps inflation up. And that's certainly been weighing on the RBA board's minds. But we're also mindful that the tax take has risen a lot lately, even with the stage 3 tax cuts, and that households have spent less out of the extra income from those tax cuts than you might have expected given history. And so it's not necessarily the case that some targeted cost of living relief will stimulate demand in a way that prevents inflation coming down further. It's really all just about how they design it.
I read online that you're giving up alcohol, junk food, social media and swearing. Is that how you're preparing for the election?
Well, it's something I do every year, and we're already in week 3. So, yes, it is something I do every year as part of the Jiu-Jitsu dojo that I'm involved in. And we're actually running it as a study this time to see what the effect of teenage girls not having social media does for their well-being and their sleep.
Beautiful. An unusual ending for an economist. Luci Ellis, it's terrific to have you on this day. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks.